Imagine for a moment that you could rewind the tape of your own day and watch yourself from the outside. You would notice something strange. You didn't really decide to do most of what you did. You didn't deliberate over which foot to swing out of bed, or whether to reach for your phone, or which route to take to work, or how many times your hand drifted toward a snack you weren't even hungry for. You just did those things, the way a river just flows downhill. Researchers at Duke University once estimated that something like 40% of the actions people perform each day are not actual decisions at all. They're habits. And that single fact carries an enormous implication. If nearly half of your life is running on autopilot, then the quality of your life is largely determined by the quality of your automatic behaviors. Change the autopilot, and you change almost everything. That is the promise and the provocation at the heart of Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit. It is a book that takes something we barely notice, the invisible scaffolding of routine that holds up our days, and makes it visible. And once you can see it, Duhigg argues, you can begin to redesign it. Not through willpower alone, not through white knuckles and New Year's resolutions that collapse by February, but through understanding the actual machinery of how habits form and how they can be transformed. In the next several minutes, I want to walk you through that machinery. I want to show you the loop that governs your behavior, the surprisingly hopeful rule for changing it, and the way this simple idea ripples outward from a single person biting their nails, all the way up to giant corporations, social movements, and the question of whether we are truly responsible for the things we do. Charles Duhigg is a journalist, and that matters, because The Power of Habit reads less like a self-help manual and more like a collection of gripping stories told by someone who cannot resist chasing down one more source. Duhigg spent years as a reporter for the New York Times, where he shared in a Pulitzer Prize for a series of investigations, and he brings that investigative instinct to this book. He is not primarily a scientist offering his own laboratory findings. He is a translator and a storyteller, someone who reads the neuroscience and the psychology, then goes and finds the human beings whose lives illustrate what the science means. The book arrived in 2012 at a particular moment in the culture. Behavioral science was having its public breakthrough. Books about how irrationally we make decisions were becoming bestsellers, and there was a growing appetite for the idea that our minds are not the rational command centers we imagine, but something messier and more mechanical. Duhigg's contribution was to take one specific corner of that landscape, the neurology and psychology of habit, and to build an entire architecture of understanding around it. What makes the book endure is that it refuses to stay small. Duhigg could have written a tidy volume about how you personally can floss more or drink less. Instead, he uses the individual habit as a lens, and then he keeps zooming out. He asks how habits shape companies, how they shape movements, how a single keystone behavior can reorganize a person's entire life or a corporation's entire culture. The result is a book that is genuinely about individual self-improvement and also about sociology, organizational behavior, marketing, and even a little bit of philosophy. It manages to be practical without being shallow, which is a rare balance. At the center of everything Duhigg describes is a deceptively simple structure he calls the habit loop, and it has 3 parts. First, there is a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to switch into automatic mode and which routine to use. Then there is the routine itself, the behavior, which can be physical, mental, or emotional. And finally, there is a reward, which is the thing that tells your brain whether this particular loop is worth remembering for the future. Cue, routine, reward. That is the whole engine. To understand why this loop exists, Duhigg takes us into the brain, and specifically to a golf ball-sized clump of tissue near the center of the skull called the basal ganglia. Scientists made a startling discovery studying rats running through a maze. When a rat first encounters the maze, its brain is working furiously, processing every scent and sound and turn. But as the rat runs the same maze over and over and learns the path to the chocolate, something remarkable happens. The brain activity actually goes quiet in the middle of the run. The mental effort spikes at the beginning, when the cue appears, and again at the end, when the reward arrives, but in between, the brain essentially powers down. The behavior has been converted into a habit and stored in the basal ganglia, so the thinking part of the brain can rest. This reveals why habits exist at all. The brain is constantly looking for ways to save effort. It is, in a sense, lazy in the most efficient possible way. If it can take a sequence of actions and bundle them together into an automatic routine, a process researchers call chunking, then it frees up mental capacity for other things. This is why you can drive home while thinking about a conversation or brush your teeth while planning your day. Your brain has chunked those behaviors so thoroughly that you barely register performing them. Habits are, in this light, a kind of gift. Without them, we would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of tiny decisions life requires. But that same efficiency is a double edge. The brain cannot tell the difference between a good habit and a bad one. It will just as happily automate your morning cigarette as your morning run. And crucially, Duhigg emphasizes that habits never truly disappear. Once a loop is carved into the basal ganglia, it lies there dormant, waiting for the right cue. This is why people who have not smoked in years can be ambushed by a sudden, overwhelming urge when they smell a certain scent or return to an old bar. The neurological pathway was never erased. It was only overwritten. That fact sounds discouraging, but Duhigg turns it into the foundation of hope, because if habits cannot be erased, then the real question becomes how to change what runs along those existing tracks. There is a hidden ingredient that Duhigg introduces, one that turns the mechanical loop into something with real emotional force. That ingredient is craving. A cue and a reward are not enough on their own to create a powerful habit. What locks the loop into place is when your brain begins to anticipate the reward, when the cue starts to produce a longing for what comes next. The habit becomes automatic only when your mind starts craving the payoff before it arrives. Duhigg illustrates this with the strange history of toothpaste. A century ago, most Americans did not brush their teeth, and a marketing pioneer named Claude Hopkins was tasked with selling a product called Pepsodent. He built a campaign around the film that coats your teeth, promising beauty if you brushed it away. But the real genius, discovered later, was an almost accidental ingredient in the toothpaste that created a cool, tingling sensation on the tongue and gums. People came to crave that tingle. If they brushed and did not feel it, they felt that something was wrong. The tingle became the reward their brains anticipated, and the anticipation is what drove millions of people to build a lifelong brushing habit. The same principle explains why the makers of a certain cleaning spray struggled until they added a pleasant scent, so that a clean room came with a satisfying signal, a reward the brain could learn to want. Understanding craving unlocks what Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change, and it is perhaps the single most useful idea in the entire book. You cannot simply extinguish a bad habit through sheer force. What you can do is keep the old cue and deliver the old reward, but insert a new routine in the middle. You leave the two ends of the loop intact and swap out the behavior that connects them. If you smoke because a moment of stress sends you searching for a jolt of stimulation and a brief escape, you do not try to eliminate the cue of stress or pretend you do not want relief. Instead, you find a new routine, perhaps a short walk or a piece of gum or a few deep breaths, that responds to the same cue and delivers a similar reward. The craving still gets satisfied, but the destructive behavior is replaced. This is the method that underlies a great deal of successful behavior change, from quitting smoking to breaking a nail-biting habit, and it works precisely because it respects the architecture of the brain instead of fighting against it. Once Duhigg has established how a single habit works, he asks a bigger question. If we have dozens or hundreds of habits, are they all equally important, or do some matter more than others? His answer is that certain habits are disproportionately powerful. He calls them keystone habits, and they're the ones that, when they change, set off a chain reaction that reshapes other behaviors as well. The signature story here is about a man named Paul O'Neill, who became the chief executive of the aluminum manufacturer Alcoa. When O'Neill took over, investors were alarmed because in his first major speech, he did not talk about profits or margins or efficiency. He talked about worker safety. He announced that his goal was to make Alcoa the safest company in America, 0 injuries. It sounded like a strange, almost naive priority for a giant industrial firm. But O'Neill understood something profound. Safety was a keystone habit. To achieve 0 injuries, the company had to understand exactly why every accident happened, which meant it had to analyze its own processes in fine detail. which meant that information had to flow instantly from the factory floor all the way up to management, which meant breaking down old bureaucratic barriers and empowering frontline workers to speak up and improve their work. By pulling on the single thread of safety, O'Neill unraveled and rewove the entire culture of the company. Communication improved, processes got tighter, quality rose, and Alcoa's profits soared to record levels. The Keystone habit of safety had transformed everything around it. The same pattern shows up in individual lives. Researchers have found that when people start exercising regularly, even just once a week, they often begin, without consciously intending to change other unrelated patterns. They eat better, they procrastinate less, they use their credit cards less, they feel less stressed. Exercise turns out to be a keystone habit for many people, a small change that spills over into unexpected corners of life. The lesson is that you do not have to fix everything at once. You just have to find the right lever. Keystone habits work partly because they create what Duhigg calls small wins. A small win is a modest, concrete accomplishment that provides a jolt of momentum and evidence that larger change is possible. Small wins convince you that transformation is within reach, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling, one small victory setting up the conditions for the next. If there is one keystone habit that stands above the rest, Duhigg argues, it is willpower. Study after study has shown that a person's capacity for self-discipline predicts success in school and life more reliably than raw intelligence does. But the book's treatment of willpower is far more interesting than the usual lecture about trying harder, because it reframes willpower not as a fixed character trait, but as something more like a muscle, and something that can itself become a habit. Consider the finding that willpower gets tired. In one famous experiment, students were seated in front of a plate of fresh-baked cookies and a bowl of radishes. Some were told they could eat the cookies, and others were told to resist the cookies and eat only the radishes. Then both groups were given a frustrating, unsolvable puzzle. The students who had been forced to resist the cookies, to exert their self-control, gave up on the puzzle far sooner. They had spent their willpower on the cookies and had less left for persistence. This is the idea of a limited reservoir of self-discipline that gets depleted through use, like a muscle that fatigues. But the more hopeful half of the muscle metaphor is that muscles can be strengthened. People who practice self-control in one area of life, even something as small as monitoring their spending or improving their posture, tend to grow stronger willpower that carries over into other areas. The deepest insight, though, comes from how the coffee company Starbucks trained its employees. Starbucks depended on legions of young workers, many of whom arrived with little experience of self-discipline, to remain calm and gracious even when a customer was screaming in their face. The company discovered that willpower crumbles most reliably at moments of stress and surprise. So instead of simply telling employees to have more willpower, Starbucks taught them specific habits for those exact inflection points. Employees learned routines, one of them nicknamed the latte method, that scripted out precisely how to respond when a situation turned hostile. They rehearsed the plan in advance, so that when the difficult moment arrived, they did not have to summon willpower from scratch. They simply executed a habit they had already built. This is the crucial move. You can turn willpower into an automatic response by planning for the hard moments before they happen, by deciding in advance exactly what you will do when temptation or stress strikes. Willpower stops being an exhausting act of resistance and becomes just another loop in the basal ganglia. There is one more subtle finding that Duhigg draws out, and it is about autonomy. When people feel that they are exercising self-control because they have been ordered to, their willpower drains quickly and they resent it. But when they feel that a choice is genuinely their own, that they are in control of their own behavior, self-discipline becomes far less draining. The feeling of agency is itself a source of strength. Duhigg then makes a leap that gives the book much of its scope. Habits, he argues, do not live only inside individual skulls. They also live inside institutions. Every company, every hospital, every organization runs on routines, on unwritten patterns of behavior that determine how work actually gets done. These organizational habits are often far more powerful than the official rules or the mission statement on the wall. And critically, they include something Duhigg calls truces, unspoken arrangements that keep the peace between different departments and rival ambitions. Organizations are full of people who want power and want to protect their turf, and the routines that govern the place quietly balance those competing interests so that the whole thing does not descend into open warfare. Most of the time, these truces are useful because they keep an organization functioning. But they can also become dangerous because a bad truce can allow serious problems to go ignored. Duhigg tells the harrowing story of a hospital where a rigid, dysfunctional culture, one in which nurses were afraid to challenge arrogant surgeons, led to a catastrophic surgical error, an operation performed on the wrong side of a patient's brain. The organizational habits, the routines of deference and silence, had made disaster almost inevitable. The counterpoint is a story about crisis. Duhigg describes a devastating fire in the London Underground, at the King's Cross station, where a small fire on an escalator was allowed to grow because the organization's habits had fragmented responsibility so thoroughly that no single person felt empowered to act. Different departments each handled only their narrow piece, and the fire fell into the cracks between them. Dozens of people died. But out of that tragedy came reform, and this is Duhigg's larger point. A crisis, as painful as it is, creates a rare window in which the old truces are suspended and destructive habits can finally be rebuilt. Wise leaders understand that a crisis should not be wasted. It is a moment when an organization is willing to change its automatic behaviors in ways that would be impossible during ordinary times. The book also turns its attention to the way companies have learned to exploit our habits, and here it becomes a little unsettling. Duhigg describes how retailers gather enormous amounts of data about our purchasing patterns and how they use that data to figure out our habits and even to detect the moments when those habits are in flux. There is a now famous account of a large retail chain whose statisticians built a model that could predict, from subtle shifts in a shopper's buying patterns, that a woman was likely pregnant, sometimes before she had told anyone. The reason the company cared so much is that major life events, like having a baby, are precisely the moments when established shopping habits break down and become malleable. If a store can reach you at that vulnerable moment, it can capture your loyalty for years. But there is a limit. When the company began sending pregnancy-related advertisements to women who had told no one, the campaign felt invasive, even frightening, and it backfired. The solution the company found reveals a great deal about human psychology. They simply mixed the pregnancy advertisements in among ordinary, unrelated ones so that the targeting was disguised. The coupons for baby items sat next to coupons for lawnmowers and wine glasses, and suddenly the whole thing felt familiar and safe rather than creepy. Duhigg connects this to a study of how radio stations get people to like new songs. When a new, unfamiliar song is played, listeners tend to switch stations because unfamiliarity is uncomfortable. But when that same new song is sandwiched between two songs people already know and love, they stay, and eventually they come to love the new song too. The principle is that we crave the familiar and that new behaviors and new products succeed most easily when they are dressed up in the clothing of the old and comfortable. Change is most palatable when it does not announce itself as change. From companies, Duhigg zooms out one more level, to entire societies, and asks how social movements are built. His central example is the Montgomery bus boycott, the campaign that helped ignite the American civil rights movement after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Duhigg's argument is not that Rosa Parks was uniquely brave, though she was. It is that the movement that grew from her arrest succeeded because of a particular set of social habits, and he identifies 3 stages. First, a movement begins because of the social habits of friendship and the strong ties between close acquaintances. Rosa Parks was widely known and deeply respected across many different communities in Montgomery. When she was arrested, a broad network of people who personally cared about her felt compelled to respond. Movements often start with the strong bonds of people who feel a personal obligation to one another. Second, a movement grows because of the habits of a community and the weak ties that bind a broader group together. The subtle social pressure of the wider neighborhood, the sense that everyone you loosely know is participating and that you would be conspicuous if you did not, pulls in thousands of people who did not personally know Rosa Parks at all. Peer pressure, in this positive form, becomes an engine of mass participation. Third, and most importantly, a movement endures only when its leaders give participants new habits and a new sense of identity, so that the movement carries itself forward even under pressure. Duhigg connects this third stage to the story of a pastor named Rick Warren, who built one of the largest churches in America. Warren discovered that inspiration alone could not sustain a congregation. What sustained it was giving people concrete new habits, small groups, daily practices, and a reshaped sense of who they were, so that the community became self-propelling. Movements, whether spiritual or political, take root when they hand people not just a cause, but a new set of automatic behaviors and a new identity to live inside. The book closes with its most philosophically challenging question. If so much of what we do is automatic, if our behavior is governed by loops carved into ancient parts of the brain, then are we really responsible for our actions? Duhigg confronts this by placing two stories side by side. In one, a man commits a terrible act of violence while sleepwalking, in a state where his conscious mind was entirely absent and his brain was running a kind of primitive automatic program with no awareness at all. In the other, a woman gambles away her family's fortune, driven by a compulsive habit so powerful it felt beyond her control. The law and our moral intuitions treated these two people very differently. The sleepwalker was found not responsible because there was genuinely no possibility of conscious choice. The gambler was held responsible for her debts. Duhigg sits with the discomfort of that distinction, and he arrives at a conclusion that is both demanding and empowering. The difference, he suggests, comes down to awareness. The sleepwalker had no way of knowing that his habits could produce such an outcome. But the gambler, and by extension all of us, once we understand that a habit exists and that it can be changed, acquire a new kind of responsibility. Freedom, in Duhigg's view, is not the absence of habits. That is impossible because we will always run on automatic behaviors. Freedom is the awareness that habits can be examined and rebuilt, and the responsibility that comes with that awareness. Once you know that the loop is there, and once you know that you have the power to change it, the choice and the accountability become yours. Let me gather the practical threads of this book into something you can carry with you. The first takeaway is the loop itself. Every habit consists of a cue, a routine, and a reward, and it is held together by a craving for that reward. If you want to understand any habit, good or bad, your own or someone else's, start by identifying those three components. Ask what triggers the behavior, what the behavior actually is, and what payoff your brain is really seeking. The second takeaway is the golden rule of change. You almost never succeed by trying to erase a habit through willpower alone, because the neurological pathway does not disappear. Instead, keep the cue and keep the reward, and change only the routine in the middle. Find a new behavior that responds to the same trigger and delivers the same satisfaction. To do this, Duhigg suggests you experiment. When a craving hits, try different routines and see which one actually addresses the reward you are chasing. You may discover that the office snack you reach for every afternoon is not really about hunger at all, but about a desire for a short break and a moment of social connection, in which case a walk to chat with a colleague might satisfy the craving completely. The third takeaway is to look for keystone habits, the small changes that trigger a cascade. You do not need to overhaul your entire life at once. You need to find the one habit, perhaps exercise, perhaps making your bed, perhaps a family dinner, that quietly reorganizes the habits around it. And you should chase small wins, because momentum and self-belief are built one modest victory at a time. The fourth takeaway concerns willpower. Treat it as a muscle that can be strengthened but also fatigued. Protect it and, more importantly, do not rely on it in the moment of crisis. Instead, plan for your hard moments in advance. Decide now, specifically, what you will do when the stress or the temptation arrives, so that in the difficult moment you are simply following a routine rather than fighting a war. The fifth takeaway is that belief matters, especially belief carried by community. Duhigg observes that the people who succeed most durably in changing deep habits, whether through recovery programs or through the guidance of a great mentor, are those who come to believe that change is truly possible. And that belief is almost always strengthened by belonging to a group of others who are changing alongside them. When you are alone and under pressure, belief falters. Within a community, it holds. What stays with me most about the power of habit is the shift in perspective it offers. We tend to think of ourselves as the sum of our decisions, as captains consciously steering the ship of our lives. Duhigg gently corrects that picture. Much of the time we are not steering at all. We are being carried along by currents we laid down long ago, in moments we barely remember, and those currents shape our health, our work, our relationships, and our happiness far more than any single dramatic choice ever will. That could be a bleak realization, an admission that we are prisoners of our routines. But Duhigg insists, and I think he is right, that it is actually the opposite. It is liberating. Because the same mechanism that traps us is the one that can free us. The very automaticity that makes a bad habit so hard to break is also what makes a good habit so effortless once it takes hold. You do not have to be a person of superhuman discipline to transform your life. You have to be a person who understands the loop, who is willing to experiment patiently with the routine while honoring the cue and the reward, and who builds around themselves the belief and the community that make change stick. There is a quiet, almost tender idea running underneath all the science and all the corporate case studies in this book. It is that change does not require you to become someone entirely new. The tracks are already laid in your brain and they are not going anywhere. Your job is not to tear them up. Your job is simply to send a better train down the line. Once you can see the habit for what it is, once you understand that it is not your destiny but merely a pattern, you hold in your hands the possibility of remaking it. And in that possibility lies something close to the whole promise of an examined and deliberate life. We are creatures of habit, yes. But we are also, uniquely, creatures capable of choosing which habits will carry us. That awareness, Duhigg reminds us, is where real freedom begins.